Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. They say the deep woods keep their secrets. In the sprawling, impenetrable darkness of the Pacific Northwest, the laws of civilization do not apply. Tonight, we journey off the map and into the unknown, following 4 young women who ventured into the wilderness seeking peace, only to come face to face with a terrifying myth bleeding out in the dark. What happens when the medical oath to save a life collides with an ancient, undocumented apex predator? And more chillingly, what happens a decade later, when the deepest, most feral evils of the forest demand blood, and an old, impossible debt is finally called in? Before we step off the trail and into the shadows, if you find yourself captivated by the unexplained, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below letting me know what you would do if you encountered the unknown. Now, let's get into tonight's story. Bigfoot repaid the favor. If you look at a map of the Pacific Northwest, specifically the sprawling, rugged expanse of the Cascade Mountains in Washington state, you will see a whole lot of green. Millions and millions of acres of old-growth forests, jagged peaks, plunging valleys, and rivers that carve through the landscape like veins. It is one of the most breathtakingly beautiful places on the planet, but it is also incredibly isolating. Once you step off the main trails and push past the tree line, you are entering a world that operates by its own rules. It is a place where humans are no longer at the top of the food chain, and where the silence is so heavy, it can actually make your ears ring. For the 4 young women at the center of tonight's story, that isolation was exactly what they were looking for. Their real names are Jessica Miller, Samantha Hayes, Megan Carter, and Chloe Evans. To understand what happened to these 4 women, we have to go back to the beginning. The date was September 14th, 2012. At this time, Jessica, Samantha, Megan, and Chloe were all in their early 20s, and they were in the final, grueling months of a highly competitive nursing program at a prestigious university in Seattle. If you know anyone who has been through nursing school, you know that it is a meat grinder. For 2 solid years, these women had lived on a diet of black coffee, protein bars, and maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. They had spent thousands of hours in clinical rotations, dealing with trauma, disease, and the intense, high-stakes pressure of the medical field. They were exhausted, burned out, and desperate for a reset before their final board exams. Jessica, who was the unofficial leader of the group, grew up in the Pacific Northwest and had been camping her entire life. She proposed a 4-day, off-the-grid backpacking trip deep into the Snoqualmie region, specifically an area known by locals as Echo Ridge. It was a notoriously difficult hike, requiring a steep 4-mile trek up an unmaintained logging road, followed by another 2 miles of bushwhacking through dense ferns and towering Douglas firs. But the reward was a pristine, secluded clearing situated right next to a crystal-clear glacial stream surrounded by sheer rock faces. It was the perfect place to unplug, because out there, cell service didn't just drop out, it ceased to exist entirely. On the morning of September 14th, 2012, the 4 women loaded up Jessica's beat-up Subaru Outback and drove 3 hours east of Seattle. When they arrived at the trailhead, the weather was crisp, with a low-hanging marine layer of fog clinging to the tops of the trees. They strapped on their heavy packs, which, because they were nursing students, included an incredibly overstocked professional-grade trauma and first aid medical kit, and began the grueling hike up the mountain. By the time they reached the clearing at Echo Ridge, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. They set up their tents in a semicircle around a pre-existing stone fire ring, gathered deadwood, and soon had a crackling fire going. For the first few hours, it was exactly what they needed. They drank hot cocoa, roasted marshmallows, complained about their clinical instructors, and laughed louder than they had in months. But as the night wore on, the temperature plummeted, and the forest grew overwhelmingly dark. If you have never been in an old-growth forest at night, It is a darkness that feels heavy, almost suffocating. Around midnight, the conversation died down, and the girls zipped themselves into their sleeping bags. Jessica and Megan shared one tent, while Samantha and Chloe shared the other. At approximately 2 a.m. on September 15th, 2012, Jessica was startled awake by a sound. It wasn't a subtle snapping of a twig. It was a massive, violent crash, followed by the sound of heavy wood splintering and breaking. It sounded as though a bulldozer had just plowed through the tree line about 50 yards from their camp. Jessica sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Beside her, Megan was already sitting up, clutching her sleeping bag to her chest, her eyes wide with terror in the pitch-black tent. From the other tent, they heard Chloe whisper shout, "Did you guys hear that?" Before anyone could answer, a sound echoed through the woods that made the blood freeze in their veins. It was a vocalization, but it was unlike any animal they had ever heard. It started as a low, guttural rumble that vibrated in the girls' chests, and then escalated into a deafening, agonizing roar that ended in a sickening, wet gurgle. It was the sound of something massive, and it was the sound of something in unimaginable pain. Then, the smell hit them. It rolled into the campsite like a physical wave. It smelled like a mixture of wet dog, decaying leaves, pungent musk, and underneath it all, the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Every instinct in their bodies screamed at them to stay in their tents, to hide, to pretend they didn't hear it. But as the agonizing, ragged breathing continued from the brush just beyond the firelight, the silence that followed was broken by a pathetic, whining whimper. Jessica, whose nursing instincts were wired to run toward pain rather than away from it, grabbed her heavy-duty Maglite flashlight. "Someone is out there, and they are hurt," she whispered. Megan grabbed her arm. "Jess, don't. That is not a person. You heard that roar? It's a bear or a cougar. If it's hurt, it will kill you." "I can't just lay here while something bleeds to death," Jessica replied. She unzipped the tent. The frigid air hit her immediately. She clicked on the Maglite, the powerful beam cutting a blinding white swath through the darkness. Samantha and Chloe cautiously unzipped their tent as well, holding their own flashlights. Together, the 4 women, armed with nothing but flashlights and their overstuffed trauma kit, slowly walked toward the tree line where the horrific sounds had originated. The brush was incredibly thick, and the beam of their flashlights bounced off the wet leaves. As they pushed through a thicket of blackberry bushes, Jessica's light caught something on the ground. It was a massive pool of thick, dark, crimson blood, soaking into the pine needles. She traced the blood trail with her light, moving it up a small embankment until the beam landed on a shape resting against the base of a massive cedar tree. When the light hit the creature, all 4 women stopped dead in their tracks, their minds completely unable to process what they were looking at. Slumped against the tree was a bipedal creature that was easily 8 feet tall. It was covered from head to toe in thick, matted auburn hair. It had a massive, barrel-shaped chest, arms that hung down past its knees, and a head that sat squarely on its shoulders with almost no visible neck. It was a Bigfoot, a real, living, breathing Sasquatch. But it wasn't acting like the terrifying monster from the movies. It was slumped over, panting heavily, its massive chest heaving. As the light hit its face, the creature raised a gigantic, leathery hand to block the glare. Jessica slowly lowered the beam to the creature's lower body, and she gasped. The creature had apparently been traversing the ridge above them and had fallen. In the fall, it had landed on a massive, jagged, splintered stump of a dead tree. The wood had acted like a spear, gouging a horrifying, deep laceration across the creature's right thigh, easily 14 inches long and several inches deep. Dark, arterial blood was pulsing out of the wound in a steady, terrifying rhythm. The creature was bleeding out. Megan started to hyperventilate, stepping backward. "We need to run. We need to run right now." But Jessica didn't move. She looked from the horrific wound up to the creature's face. The Sasquatch lowered its hand and looked directly at Jessica. And that is when Jessica realized something that would change her life forever. The creature's eyes were not the dead, black eyes of an animal. They were deeply intelligent, amber-colored eyes, filled with profound suffering, fear, and a desperate plea for help. It let out another low, rattling whimper, and its head lolled to the side. It was going into hypovolemic shock. Without thinking, the thousands of hours of intense medical training took over, overriding her primal fear. "Sam, get the trauma kit, now!" Jessica barked, her voice suddenly taking on the authoritative tone of an emergency room charge nurse. "Are you insane?" Chloe screamed. "It's a monster!" "It's a patient," Jessica yelled back. "And it's crashing. Get the kit." The sheer force of Jessica's command snapped the other three women out of their paralyzed state. Samantha sprinted back to the tents, returning seconds later with the heavy red medical bag. Jessica approached the creature slowly, holding her hands up, speaking in a low, calm, soothing voice. "Hey, big guy, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. We are going to help." The creature tensed as she got closer, bearing a set of massive, flat, human-like teeth, but it was too weak to fight. It let out a huff of air and allowed its head to fall back against the tree. What followed was one of the most surreal and intense medical procedures ever performed. The 4 nursing students knelt in the mud and blood of the Pacific Northwest forest, treating a creature of myth. Megan, her hands shaking, snapped on sterile gloves and began applying direct, heavy pressure to the massive thigh wound with thick stacks of 4x4 gauze. The creature flinched and let out a low growl of pain, but remarkably, it did not strike out. It seemed to understand that they were trying to stop the bleeding. "The laceration is too deep. It's nicked a minor artery," Jessica said, her hands covered in the creature's hot blood. "We need to irrigate it and pack it, or he's going to bleed out." Samantha ripped open bottles of sterile saline, aggressively flushing the wound, washing away the mud, pine needles, and splinters of wood that were embedded in the torn muscle tissue. The sheer anatomy of the creature was staggering. The muscle fibers were thick and dense, like steel cables. Chloe, crying silently but working with mechanical efficiency, handed Jessica a hemostat and a surgical needle threaded with thick nylon sutures. "I don't have lidocaine. This is gonna hurt," Jessica whispered to the creature. As Jessica drove the thick needle through the creature's tough, leathery skin, it let out a deafening, echoing roar that shook the trees, and its massive hand shot out, grabbing Jessica's shoulder. The women froze. The creature could have crushed Jessica's collarbone with a twitch of its fingers, but it didn't. It just held her firmly, squeezed its eyes shut, and breathed through its nose in heavy, rhythmic snorts. It was enduring the pain. For the next 45 minutes, the woman worked like a well-oiled machine. Jessica threw 32 deep internal stitches to tie off the bleeders and pull the massive muscle bellies together, followed by a heavy row of external staples they had in their emergency trauma pack to close the thick skin. Megan and Samantha then wrapped the entire thigh in layers of thick gauze, securing it with several rolls of cohesive bandage and medical tape, wrapping it tight enough to act as a pressure dressing. When they were finally done, the 4 women sat back on their heels, covered in sweat, mud, and blood. The creature was exhausted. Its breathing had slowed to a steady, calm rhythm. The bleeding had completely stopped. Jessica slowly reached out and placed her small, blood-stained hand on the creature's massive forearm. The Sasquatch opened its amber eyes, looked at her hand, and then looked into her eyes. Very slowly, it lifted its other hand, a hand the size of a snowshoe, and gently, almost impossibly delicately, rested its massive index finger on top of Jessica's head for a single second. It was an unmistakable gesture of gratitude. Terrified that the creature's family might be looking for it, and completely overwhelmed by the adrenaline crash, the women quietly backed away. They returned to their campsite, packed their gear in record time in the pitch black, and hiked the grueling 6 miles back to their car by the light of their flashlights, constantly looking over their shoulders. They drove back to Seattle in complete silence. They never told anyone what happened. Who would believe them? They would be laughed out of their nursing program. They threw away their blood-stained clothes and agreed to lock the memory away forever. Time is a funny thing. It has a way of burying trauma, but it never truly erases it. Fast forward 10 years, The date was now October 9th, 2022. Jessica, Samantha, Megan, and Chloe were no longer wide-eyed students. They were seasoned, hardened, registered nurses. Jessica was a charge nurse in a level 1 trauma center emergency room. Megan worked in a high acuity intensive care unit. Samantha was a flight nurse, and Chloe worked in pediatric oncology. Over the past decade, they had seen the absolute worst of human suffering. They had worked through a global pandemic, they had coded countless patients, and they had developed the thick skin required to survive in modern medicine. But despite their intense careers, the four of them remained incredibly close. The secret they shared from the woods of Echo Ridge bonded them in a way that nothing else could. In the fall of 2022, all four women were feeling the crushing weight of burnout. The hospital shifts were relentless, the understaffing was brutal, and the emotional toll was heavy. They needed an escape. Over drinks one evening, Jessica brought up an idea that sounded like absolute madness. "We need to go back," she said, "to Echo Ridge." At first, the other three immediately rejected the idea. But Jessica explained her reasoning. For 10 years, the memory of that night had haunted them. It felt like a fever dream, an unresolved loop in their minds. They needed to go back to prove to themselves that they were no longer those terrified students, and to reclaim the peace of the woods that they had lost. They were tough, experienced women now. They could handle a camping trip. Reluctantly, the group agreed. On the morning of October 14th, 2022, the four RNs loaded up a rented SUV and drove back to the Snoqualmie region. They parked at the exact same overgrown trailhead they had used a decade prior. As they began the hike up the mountain, the nostalgia was heavy. The forest looked exactly the same. The towering Douglas firs, the thick ferns, the smell of damp earth. But as they pushed deeper into the woods, crossing the 4-mile mark, something began to feel fundamentally wrong. During their first trip, the forest had been alive, with the sounds of nature, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But today, the forest was dead silent. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to swallow their footsteps. Do you guys feel that? Megan asked, adjusting the straps of her backpack. It feels like we're being watched. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. Jessica reassured her, though she secretly felt the exact same crawling sensation on the back of her neck. They reached the clearing at Echo Ridge by late afternoon. They set up their tents in the same semicircle, built a fire, and tried to relax. But the uneasy feeling refused to dissipate. The first sign of actual trouble happened the next morning, on October 15th, 2022. Chloe woke up early and went to the edge of the camp where they had strung up their bear bag, a heavy sack containing all their food and scented items, hoisted 20 feet into the air on a sturdy branch to keep it away from wildlife. The bag was gone. The rope hadn't snapped. It had been untied from the trunk of the tree with deliberate human precision. Chloe called the other girls over. "A bear didn't do this," she said, pointing to the perfectly unspooled rope laying on the ferns. "Someone took our food." Panic began to set in. They were 6 miles deep in the wilderness, miles from any maintained trail. Who else was out here? Jessica, trying to maintain calm, suggested they pack up and leave immediately. They had enough emergency protein bars in their day packs to make the hike back down. They began rapidly breaking down the tents. As Samantha was rolling up her sleeping pad, she paused and looked toward the tree line. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the thick ferns, was a structure that had not been there the day before. It was a tripod made of thick, rotting branches, lashed together with what looked like dried animal intestines. Hanging from the center of the tripod were several small skulls, raccoon and possum, along with bundles of dirty, matted human hair. "Guys," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at that." As the women stared in horror at the macabre totem, the silence of the forest was shattered by a sound that made their blood run cold. It was a sharp, piercing whistle coming from the woods to their left. A second later, a clicking sound, like 2 rocks being struck together, rapidly answered from the woods to their right. They were surrounded. "Leave the gear. Grab the bear spray. We walk out right now. Jessica commanded, her heart hammering. The four women clustered together, back to back, each holding a large canister of pepper spray, and began to move toward the trail that led back to the car. They hadn't made it 20 yards when the first figure stepped out from behind a massive cedar tree, blocking the trail. It was a human, but it looked like a nightmare. It was a man, severely gaunt, his ribs showing through his pale, dirt-caked skin. He wore nothing but a filthy, rotting pair of canvas trousers. His hair was long, matted with mud and leaves, and his face was smeared with dark soot or dried blood. But the most terrifying part was his eyes. They were completely wild, devoid of any humanity, burning with a predatory, malicious hunger. He held a heavy, sharpened wooden spear in his right hand. These were the feral people of the Cascades. Deep woods urban legends spoken of in hushed tones by park rangers, groups of humans who had lived entirely off the grid for generations, devolving into violent, animalistic clans, completely devoid of language or modern morality, preying on whatever or whoever wandered into their territory. The feral man let out a hissing, clicking sound from his throat, revealing a mouth full of rotting, blackened teeth. Instantly, 3 more figures emerged from the brush around the women. 2 more men, equally filthy and wild-eyed, and a woman whose face was heavily scarred, clutching a crude, heavy stone club. "Get back!" Jessica screamed, holding up the bear spray. "We will spray you! Get back!" The feral people didn't flinch. They began to circle the women slowly, tightening the ring, clicking their tongues and whistling to one another, coordinating their attack like a pack of wolves. Megan was crying hysterically. Samantha was hyperventilating. Jessica gripped the bear spray so hard her knuckles turned white. They were trained to save lives, not to fight for their own against wild humans. The feral man blocking the trail suddenly let out a screeching yell and lunged forward, thrusting the sharpened spear directly at Jessica's chest. Jessica reacted purely on instinct, sidestepping the thrust and holding down the trigger of the bear spray. A thick, orange cloud of high-potency capsicum blasted directly into the man's face. He shrieked in agony, dropping the spear and clawing at his eyes, stumbling backward into the brush. But the attack triggered the others. The scarred woman charged at Chloe, swinging the stone club. Chloe ducked, but the club clipped her shoulder, sending her crashing to the forest floor with a scream of pain. One of the other men tackled Samantha from behind, driving her face first into the mud, his filthy hands wrapping around her throat. Jessica spun around, trying to aim the bear spray, but the last feral man slammed into her, knocking the canister out of her hand. He pinned her to the ground, his rotting teeth gnashing inches from her face, his foul, decaying breath making her gag. She pushed against his chest with all her might, but he possessed an insane, wiry strength. They were going to die, right here, in the dirt. They were going to be slaughtered by things that used to be human. Jessica closed her eyes, preparing for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, the ground literally shook. A roar so loud, so deafening, and so absolute in its fury erupted from the ridge directly above them. It was a sound Jessica recognized instantly, a sound she hadn't heard in 10 years. Only this time, it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a battle cry. Before the feral man pinning Jessica could even turn his head, a massive, dark blur launched from the elevated ridge, crashing through the canopy of the trees and landing in the center of the clearing with the force of an artillery shell. It was the Bigfoot, but he was no longer wounded, and he was no longer weak. Standing at his full, terrifying 8.5-foot height, the creature was an engine of pure, unadulterated muscle and primal rage. The feral man on top of Jessica was suddenly yanked upward by an invisible force. The Bigfoot had grabbed the man by his matted hair with one hand. The creature lifted the screaming feral man 7 feet into the air, and with a casual, horrifying flick of its wrist, hurled the man 30 feet across the clearing. The man slammed into the trunk of a pine tree with a sickening crunch and did not move again. The feral man, choking Samantha, let go and scrambled backward, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. The feral woman with the stone club shrieked and turned to run, but the Bigfoot was impossibly fast. It covered the distance in a single stride, backhanding the fleeing man with a force that sent him spinning through the air like a rag doll. It then let out another earth-shattering roar, beating its massive chest with fists the size of cinder blocks. The remaining feral people, realizing they were facing an apex predator of mythological proportions, scrambled into the deep brush, fleeing for their lives, their clicks and whistles replaced by terrified sobbing. Within seconds, the chaotic, violent clearing was dead silent once again, save for the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the massive Sasquatch. Jessica, trembling uncontrollably, pushed herself up from the mud. Megan crawled over to Samantha, helping her sit up, while Chloe clutched her bruised shoulder. The Bigfoot slowly turned around to face the four women. The adrenaline was still pumping through the creature's veins. Its lips were pulled back, its massive chest heaving. For a terrifying second, Jessica thought the creature might turn its aggression on them, but then the Bigfoot's posture softened. The primal rage in its amber eyes melted away, replaced by a profound, recognizable calmness. The creature took a slow, heavy step toward Jessica. Jessica didn't back away. She stood her ground, looking up at the towering giant. The Sasquatch stopped a few feet from her. Slowly, it reached down with its massive hand and pointed to its own right thigh. There, clearly visible through the thick auburn hair, was a massive, foot-long, hairless, jagged scar. The exact scar from a wound that had been painstakingly cleaned, sutured, and stapled together by 4 terrified nursing students 10 years prior. The creature remembered. It had recognized their scent, or their voices, or perhaps the sheer energy they carried. When the feral people had hunted them, the Bigfoot had come to protect the very women who had saved its life. The Bigfoot looked from the scar to Jessica's face. It let out a low, gentle, huffing sound. It then extended its massive hand, palm open, and gently nudged Jessica's shoulder, a mirror image of the touch it had given her a decade ago. Tears streamed down Jessica's face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you so much." The creature lingered for a moment longer, looking at all 4 women, ensuring they were safe. Then, without a sound, it turned around. It didn't run. It simply took 3 massive strides, and as if by magic, it blended perfectly into the dense foliage, vanishing entirely into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest forest. The 4 nurses did not waste any time, shaken, bruised, but miraculously alive. They gathered what little gear they could carry and hiked out of the woods, moving faster than they ever had in their lives. They made it back to Seattle on the evening of October 15th, 2022. Just like the first time, they never reported the incident to the authorities. How do you file a police report stating that you were attacked by feral mountain people, only to be rescued by a Sasquatch who remembered you performing emergency surgery on it 10 years ago? It was a story that no one would ever believe. But Jessica, Samantha, Megan, and Chloe didn't need anyone to believe them. They knew the truth. Today, the 4 of them are still registered nurses, saving lives in the clinical, sterile environments of modern hospitals. But every year, on the exact same date, the 4 women meet up. They don't go camping anymore. Instead, they drive to a scenic overlook, miles away from Echo Ridge, look out over the vast, endless canopy of the Cascade Mountains, and raise a glass. They raise a glass to the terrifying beauty of the wilderness. They raise a glass to the unbreakable bond of friendship forged in trauma. And most importantly, they raise a glass to the silent, massive guardian in the woods, proving that sometimes, in the darkest, most isolated corners of the world, an act of compassion can echo through the years and come back to save your life when you need it most. Wow, what an incredible and terrifying story. It just goes to show that the deep, isolating woods of the Pacific Northwest hold secrets we can barely comprehend. It also proves that a single act of compassion can echo through time, whether it happens on a cold night like September 14th, 2012, or a decade later on October 15th, 2022. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have run, or would you have stayed to help? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the unknown, please hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss an upload. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and I want to hear from you. If you have any stories, creepy encounters, or unexplained events of your own, you can send them to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com. Your experience might just be featured in our next video. Until next time, keep your eyes on the tree line, and whatever you do, stay safe out there.